Grant Robertson.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I'm sure, given, how do I say this diplomatically, the stature of the Minister who's just resumed his seat, and indeed the Speaker and the Chair, you'll forgive me a moment to congratulate Michelle Payne, the winning jockey in the Melbourne Cup, the first woman to ride a winning horse in 155 years in the Melbourne Cup, and I think a triumph worth noting. I'm sure Mr Woodhouse, if he looks for an alternative career in the coming years, could find himself there. I don't know, but a wonderful effort by Michelle Payne. No, that's right, but a wonderful effort by Michelle Payne to win the horse. And yes, also to note that the Labour Party's racing spokesperson Chris Farfoy did manage to somehow or other fluke a win by betting on that horse, and obviously drinks are on Chris this evening. Thank you very much, Mr Farfoy. We can actually put that as an amendment to the bill, Mr Speaker, to include Chris Farfoy's generous contribution to our evening entertainment. Mr Speaker, to return to the matters at hand, the Labour Party believes that this piece of legislation is a political response by the National Party to a very serious issue of speculation in the housing market. It is an inadequate response. It is a response that is driven by trying to look as if the government is doing something without actually taking on this issue. It is a token gesture where something far more serious and far-reaching was needed. And if any proof of that was needed, Mr Speaker, we learned in this process that officials have said that the implementation of this 2-year bright line test will raise an additional $5 million per annum. That's it. That's it. That's the extent of how much this will raise. And Mr Speaker, we heard time and time of the effectiveness, that's right, Mr Goff. We heard time and time again in the Select Committee from every submitter bar one that this legislation was inadequate, that it would capture the wrong people, that it was confused, that it was incoherent. One of the senior partners at one of our largest tax accounting firms, said he was professionally confused by the government's approach. That is, one of the senior partners at one of our largest tax firms said he was professionally confused by the government. And government members know that this is inadequate. Government members know that this is a political response, because we learned, Mr Speaker, that in the build-up to the budget, when the budget papers were released in July, we looked to what happened in the build-up to the budget. There are no papers on this because the government rushed this through because they thought they better look like they were doing something. And here we are in November passing the legislation for a bill that gets implemented on the 1st of October. It's completely hopeless, Mr Speaker. It's hopelessly implemented. It's hopelessly designed, and the government really should hang its head in shame. Mr Speaker, one of the core elements to emerge during the Select Committee process was exactly who would be captured by this legislation. Who would be captured? Is it the speculators who we are really concerned about, who are driving up the cost of housing in our biggest city, Auckland particularly? Is it the people who today, when we look at the price of houses in Auckland, we have quotable value telling us we've got an average house price of $980,000. Essentially $1 million average house price in Auckland, putting that out of reach for most first home buyers. You know, the data that shows us that Auckland house prices have risen by $21,500 a month in this last year. 25% increase in the value of in the cost of houses in the last 18 months. This is an Auckland housing market out of control, affecting the financial stability of our country. And at the speculation end, the government arrives with a very damp bus ticket, because that's as good as this gets. And so what the officials told us, what the submitters told us, was that if you are a person who's genuinely in there speculating, you'll just wait out the 2 years. It's a 2-year bright line test. You'll just say at the end of 2 years, that's right, I can now move on and continue with the behaviour that I would have indulged in. The people who'll be captured are the people who might have bought one property as an investment property, and then something happens in their lives. Something happens that means they have to sell it. Perhaps they lose a job, or somebody has to move. or somebody's circumstances change, which means that they don't feel that they want to have that investment property any longer. They will be the people captured by this legislation. Every single submitter acknowledged that. Every single submitter came to the committee and said, if you're trying to get the real property speculators, you've got this wrong. 2 years is just a short amount of time if you're in that business to wait. 2 years and 1 day you're away. And no doubt government members will get up and say, well, that's all right, they'll be captured by the intention test. There's a logical flaw in that argument, Mr. Speaker. The reason we're here debating this legislation is because the government tells us the intention test doesn't work now. So why will it suddenly work at the end of a 2-year period? And it's not just the submitters who said this, Mr. Speaker. When Treasury was asked for advice about this from the government, they told the government 2 years was inadequate. Actually, they said 3 years was inadequate as well. They said it shouldn't be pursued as it's very likely to yield very little revenue while generating significant behavioural distortions. The Treasury went on to say they considered a 5-year period would be the minimum at which the gains of taxing the income outweigh the costs that the test would incur through behavioural changes. The Treasury went on to say that if you look internationally, these kinds of rules and tests are applied and are useful at the 5-year mark. But that advice was ignored because the government wasn't really serious about this. Because the government wasn't really serious about dealing with speculation. It just wanted to look and appear as if it had done something. So that inadequacy around the length of time really does fundamentally undermine what the government claims are its goals. The other point that submitters in the Select Committee were at pains to make was that the legislation fails the basic test for tax law to be clear and simple to implement. A number of submitters raised their concerns about the legislation being inconsistent with other aspects of property law in its definition and coverage. Why does this matter? It matters because that means that tax accountants, those who advise people, those who said that they were professionally confused by this legislation, will struggle to be able to interpret what it means, and loopholes will end up being created. The legislation is beset with definitional difficulties, and in the Committee of the Whole House stage, we will work through these and I hope be able to improve the legislation that the government has put up. But obviously there is concerns about the definition of main home that arose from the previous legislation that this House passed. That definition of main home continues to be so subjective and so unrealistic and so easy. Well, it is. It's so easy to get around. Everybody acknowledges that, and by putting that in and bringing that through into this legislation, that adds to that question. The Minister mentioned the question of the dates of acquisition and disposal of land being the bookends of this process. That is inconsistent with other aspects of property law and no doubt will cause problems. There are difficulties around the definition of residential land, which we will come back to, and also the questions around farmland. Mr. Speaker, this legislation could have been the beginning of something useful for the Parliament to do, to take to the speculation that is driving up property prices, that is causing those ridiculous prices that I talked about earlier in the speech. But it was failed, it was rushed, it was ill-conceived. The Finance Minister, Bill English, got up in this House and said he didn't even know if it was going to work. That's as good as it gets from the government when it comes to cracking down on speculation, because they don't want to crack down on speculation. It's not in their interest. This is a half-hearted attempt. It's a token gesture when something comprehensive was needed to ensure that we clamp down on speculation. Speculation in the Auckland housing market, driven both within New Zealand and those who are offshore, is putting home buying out of reach of many New Zealanders. That's the issue that we are actually debating today. The opportunity for young New Zealanders to live out the New Zealand dream of buying that house, of having that security, of being a part of their community. And today, the national government has failed. They have lost the opportunity to do this. It is a token gesture when something meaningful was needed. It is a huge disappointment.
I call David Bennett.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.